Hi everyone, this is Aarti Maharaj back for another Ethicast, and joining me is my colleague,
Bill Coffin, editor-in-chief of Ethisphere magazine and co-host of the Ethicast.
As a reminder, we're on the floor of the Global Ethics Summit, so you may hear some chatter in the background, and that's okay. We're channeling all of that energy, but certainly a lot to talk about. So we just had our first main stage session titled The Voice of BELA, the State of the Profession, featuring Hush Blackwell, TikTok or ByteDance, Pacific Life, and Samsung. There's certainly a lot for us to talk about, Bill. So let me kick it over to you to just provide a quick heads up and just kind of help us in debriefing everything that we just heard.
Outstanding. Apologies for the sound there. Yeah, no, the state of the profession I was very much looking forward to this. This is a great annual session. You get to hear directly from the mouths of BELA thought leaders and kind of speaking directly to the reality that they're facing as ethics and compliance officers. And they raised a bunch of really fantastic points. The first question that kicked things off was sort of getting everybody to talk about their professional journey a little bit. How did they get to be, where they are now? Because a lot of people don't enter this field with the intention of being, where they are now. They kind of find themselves in their current position by kind of a circuitous path. And some of those origin stories are really quite fascinating. Somebody described themselves as a chief common sense officer. And I thought
that was interesting. Sorry to interrupt, but that was great. Yes, I've never heard that one before, but it makes a lot of sense.
I never heard that one either. And you know what? It really resounded because when you look at the chat log of the session, that one popped off. I think it's probably the most heavily commented on piece so far. It was just amazing. But it also mentioned how there was a broad sentiment across the panel that they all had a strong aversion to being, to seeing their role in compliance as that of being the police or being the Department of No. And we've heard this many times before, but it was really interesting to see how passionate they were about this is not who we are, this is not what we do, this is not what we bring value to the organization. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. They mentioned their goal was to lean into the inherent desire to succeed, to achieve, to push boundaries, and that is the most exciting part of compliance, and I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and that takes me to the other point, the 4 C's. Curiosity, courage, creativity, and finally, credibility. Credibility and authenticity, so important in this day and age. When you do a lot of stuff virtually, getting back in person, I think credibility is very important.
Absolutely. And I'm going to tell you right now, I think I discovered a business opportunity there because I mentioned in the chat that I think the 4 C's should be put on a t-shirt or a coffee mug, and people were with me. So I think if you want to go and make that swag, it's you people in the field they'll like it. They'll like it. So
I thought it was interesting. So Catherine Rosano, head of global legal compliance at ByteDance, she spoke a lot about continuous improvement, and one thing she's trying to do is to stay ahead of the game by doing a lot of reading. Like in terms of improving your skills, everything should always be a refresher. Take a moment, read, debrief, recap. It is so important for what you do in this day and age.
Absolutely. We talk here at Ethisphere, one of our key values as an organization is relentless curiosity, and she really embodied that. I think that's a sort of a key to staying live, staying nimble, and staying relevant in this field.
And she also mentioned coaching, how important that coaching and mentorship is right now. And our BELA community allows you to connect with your peers so that you can have these sort of peer-to-peer support. So coaching is so important, learning from each other, getting that feedback. I think right now we depend on that more than anything.
For sure. And there's another point that I thought was really insightful. And again, this also got an awful lot of reaction from the audience, but it was the notion of a key to success going forward is just get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we see that a lot, but I think one of the examples that followed that on pretty quickly that I thought really brought that up was the notion of ChatGPT being sort of this seismic tool that could change all the rules in what we do here. You want to talk about being comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's a great example right there of how something is developing. We don't know where it's going to go, but it's going to be part of our reality, and we have to be ready to accept it.
Yeah, and branching off of that, another point raised by Catherine was the idea of international diversity, norms that are different in different places of the world, and being agile enough to adapt, learn, and embrace a new culture, and also, think about the people in those regions and create localized policies and content that it's so easily digestible and can be consumed by a variety of audience. Like that is so important in this day and age.
Very, very much agree. We call this the Global Ethics Summit, and indeed it is. But for a lot of organizations, when they say global, what they really mean is North American, or even just the United States. And the reality is, and I thought this point was mentioned so beautifully, which is that there are many different ways of doing things around the world that are very much in line with the law and very much in line with local practice. The question is, are they in line with your culture as an organization? And how do you parse that across national boundaries, across cultural boundaries? That's very much easier said than done. And that's the highest level kind of work you can do to find out where are your sweet spots and where you're uncomfortable and what's the way to you where do you say no, where do you say yes? And there's no one way for any company to do it. It's everybody has to force that path on their own.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, Bill, because coming out of our South Asia roundtable, I would tell you that when we bring all of these leaders together to talk a little bit more about challenges, it's that idea of gift giving. It's very different in South Asia and in other parts of the world compared to the US. So certainly that is something that you have to think about when you think about the areas of priorities. Across the world.
Massively.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There were one or two other points from this session I thought were really great, and I'd love to touch upon. One was this notion of having the courage to answer a question for the first time. They were talking about the notion of being curious, always being flexible, but also being authentic and honest and transparent about when you don't know something, and being able to lean into this notion of embracing the fact you don't know everything. Don't go down every rabbit hole trying to fix everything, but also know where your limits are. And then ultimately this kind of winds back to the fact that eventually you will be tasked upon making a call in undiscovered country, and all these things kind of inform how you go about doing that. And it's a very scary thing. Obviously, they said check with corporate counsel first, right? Before you do anything, check with counsel. Note to self. But that decision to the notion of having a decision for the first time, I thought that was quite interesting. And again, we saw an awful lot of people really respond quite passionately to that in the chat, which kind of lets me know this is the truth.
For sure, and that was that idea was raised by Dan Barrios at Samsung.
Yeah.
So he was speaking to the topic of talent, and he mentioned that it is very important that you raise your hand when you're not sure about something. Lean into it. Understand that, hey, feel comfortable saying, I don't understand, I don't get this. Would you be able to educate, teach me, and also empower me about this topic? That is so important when it comes to talent. Also being relentlessly curious. You mentioned that earlier, which is something we hear a lot about at Ethisphere. And it also came up on this panel. For compliance officers, it's important to always be curious, always tap into your network to learn more.
Absolutely. And to that point, the final thing I'll just say about this session was, the notion of it's so critical to find out who's interested in working with you internally and building those relationships. We hear that again and again and again amongst people with really mature programs, really successful programs. Find out who your internal partners are going to be, build those relationships, and then things unlock and things are going to happen. I think it was Catherine Hanaway had mentioned it's auto-magical, right?
Yes.
And I think that's the term I'm going to use going forward, because you make those connections and things just tend to they don't magically fix themselves, but doors do open where you don't expect them to. That's a pretty important thing to say.
Yeah, that was a great session and an excellent way to kick off BELA Day and the Global Ethics Summit. We're going to have more of these recaps for you over the next couple of days, so stay tuned for that. If you have a question, be sure to pop those into the chat. We'll try our best to feed those questions into our program and also redirect them to our panel sessions that we have coming up. And just in case we don't get to those questions, you'll be able to have those questions possibly answered throughout the panel sessions, because a lot of these sessions at this Global Ethics Summit the topics were derived by you, our BELA members, and my expert colleagues, Emily Rickaby and Samantha Johnson, along with a couple others. So with that, let's turn to the first look at the 2023 World's Most Ethical Companies data. So Mel, what are your initial reactions to what our colleague Emily and Nino what they shared?
Well, I absolutely love this topic because I work a lot with both of them on World's Most Ethical Companies content for the current issue of the magazine. And the data that comes into this is so fascinating and it's so revealing when you see what some of the best programs out there are really doing. And some of them are data points where everybody's doing the same thing that you would expect. Some of the others are a little bit more revealing and show kind of excellence in evolution, I'd say. I think one of the earliest points we led with was how 93% of companies that are in the world's most ethical companies honoree data set for this year have onboarding with ethics and compliance for new board members. And that seems like an elementary thing, but the important thing I saw was that 93% of honorees are doing it now. Only 64% were doing it in 2021. So that's a massive kind of, coming to the light moment where they realize, you know what, you bring on a board member, it's time to get them acquainted with what ethics and compliance are all about. That way, we're going to make sure there's a great relationship from the very beginning, and it helps the board kind of deliver value in that area and make sure everybody's aligned. So I thought that was a really interesting data.
And it also ensures that compliance has a seat at the table.
Yes.
This is a topic that comes up time and time again. I mean, just coming out of the revised DOJ guidance, clearly compliance must have a seat at the table, and that data point certainly talks to that.
Absolutely. I think another one of the big universal data points is how 93% of honorees ethics compliance has some input on strategic business development. And again, we hear all the time from leaders in the field how they, one of the first things they do when they come into a company is they get to learn the business, right? And by learning the business, that empowers you to figure out how the business needs your unique qualities to make everything run better. And I think when you see that happen, that's what leads to this number, which is, ethics compliance. They're not just in the background; they're actually at the table when we're figuring how are you going to develop your business going forward? How are you going to make sustainable growth for the enterprise? E&C is there. They're part of the guidance on that. And I think that's really, really important. And it's very encouraging to see. I'm not surprised by it, but it's very encouraging to see that.
And just one question outside of our conversations, Bill. So like coming out of roundtables and the requests we get from our BELA members, do you have any thoughts on if you're a compliance leader and you're starting to focus a lot on ESG and sustainability, where do you even begin? Where do you start? What is step one? And is there a step one, or is it something where you just kind of hit the ground running?
That's a fantastic question. I think, when they mentioned it during the session, asking how many people out there had actually seen ESG added to the remit in recent years, all kinds of hands went up across the board. This is not an uncommon thing, but I think you raised a very excellent question, because I'm not sure there's a perfectly codified answer to it just yet. That's one of the great opportunities with ESG, but there's also one of the great challenges because we don't see things being totally codified.
Yeah, and then it depends on which area of ESG you're going to focus on: the social side, the governance side, or the environmental side. So
exactly.
And this is a continuous journey, going back to Catherine's point for ByteDance. It's continuous improvement. So we just learn as we go along and have lots of conversations. I know something Emily spoke about on the session earlier. So we'll talk about that in a second. But continue on, Bill, with your quick updates.
Yeah, well, with ESG, I just want to jump ahead to a couple other points to kind of touch back on ESG, where, this is a low number I thought was interesting, but only 38% of honoree companies disclose trends in ethics when they are talking about their ESG reporting. And this, to me, told me about how the state of ESG reporting itself is very much in flux. There are not a lot of really firm standards set necessarily, and a lot of kind of squish in it. And that we've heard this before from Erica, Sam Byrne, and from some other experts, that one of the challenges with ESG is not everybody is completely aligned on what exactly it means and what is required to be brought into the ESG discussion. So I think that number tells me there's an awful lot of opportunity there, even amongst companies that are the best of the best as far as ethics and compliance goes. Nobody is 100% certain just yet, and we're still trying to figure these things out. So that's a challenge and an opportunity for sure. But I will say, as an add-on to that, 90% of honorary companies are referencing the GRI framework as part of the ESG reporting, and that's up from 72% in 2021. So clearly things are still taking shape, but that GRI framework is definitely emerging as sort of one of the real Rosetta Stones of ESG reporting. I think that's a really important thing to look at.
Yeah, I like that Rosetta Stone. Really good way to connect it. We hear the same coming out of Asia Pacific as well. A lot of those companies across there follow the GRI standards. Continuing on, Bill, and folks, as this side, we're just looking at our notes, but we're coming back to you.
So many notes.
It's very exciting.
In the time we have left, I think I'll just raise one more important point, which was there's a question of how are you raising in-seat conversations with your teams? And the thing, I don't have a particular answer to share because there were so many answers offered by the audience, and that was a really amazing thing. The conversation really went in that direction for a while. And what was amazing is when you looked in the chat log, the diversity of answers and the diversity of solutions being offered showed me that there's a really vibrant ecosystem of ways you can address this that bring a lot of value to your organization, that engage your employees, and really kind of make sure that EC conversation is moving the needle in a meaningful way to your organization. It was terrific to see so many people have so many things to offer in the chat and live, live as well.
And some of the thoughts, I've just extracted a few from the online chat. A lot of folks said compliance champions, compliance clinics, one-pagers, leadership workshops on storytelling. Those narratives are so important. And speaking of narratives, we're going to hear more about that later. We do have a session, another main stage session just focused on storytelling. So that was an interesting point that came up, and we spoke about that in person a lot at the earlier session. Another topic, hot topic that came up was social media. You know, sometimes we forget about it, but social media is such an important part of all of these communications and what you equip your people managers with, those policies and guidance. Because social media is ever changing, it's evolving. There's a new platform every Monday morning. I always say that
there is.
That we all have to learn and adapt to. But that can certainly open up new risks. Another point that came out from the online conversations, it's the growth of the gig economy. Something I've also been hearing in our South Asia and Asia Pacific roundtable sessions, BELA roundtable sessions, and conflict of interest policies for employees. That is going to be definitely hot topics in the future.
An awful lot. Well, I'm just about out of time for this episode of the Ethicast. I want to thank everybody out there for tuning in and for listening to the recap. There's a lot more to come. We're going to let you go now because starting in just a few minutes is our next keynote on ethical and inclusive storytelling featuring Julie Ann Cromit, founder and CEO of Collective Moxie. She has an amazing background for this area. She's done some astonishing work in the entertainment field, and I can't wait for the session. I think we're going to learn an awful lot about it because, as we heard in the previous session, storytelling is a real key to making sure you really have a successful program.
People consume and learn from narratives. And I actually, when I was reading a little bit more about Julie Ann's background, she comes from media and entertainment background, not a legal background. So it will be interesting to hear her take and her position on this topic. So with that, folks, we'll be back with another Ethicast in a few minutes. Actually, no, correction, not in a few minutes, in about an hour.
In about an hour.
And we will debrief a little bit more and share with you Julie Ann Cromit's high level points. Thank you all. See you in a bit.
See you then.